So, we are now going to continue our conversation about challenges in the late 1800s. Here are your key terms again, just as a reminder. We're going to be doing a few more and hopefully be able to analyze the impact of mining and railroads on the settlement of the West, to explain the impact of physical and human geographic factors on the settlement of the Great Plains, to analyze the treatment of Chinese immigrants and Mexican Americans in the West, and to discuss the ways various groups used land in the West and also the conflicts among them. So I want you to think back to yesterday in our conversation about Native American groups, but also to, again, topic 2, and build from there about the Transcontinental Railroad, the treatment of Chinese workers, and even the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we will be revisiting here. So, just a general little graphic here for you that talks about the causes of migration to the Great Plains. First would be, this Homestead Act. Under the Homestead Act, you got 160 acres of land, totally scot-free, as long as you promised to live on it for 5 years. You had to build a farm, and you had to build a dwelling that was considered permanent. 10% of U.S. land is given away under the Homestead Act. It's in effect for the course of about 123 years. Lots of claims, 4 million claims, are made under the Homestead Act, and even more acreage distributed by the Homestead Act. There's also a quote over here by someone named Solomon Lewis, who is a known exoduster. He said, "When I landed on the soil of Kansas, I looked on the ground, and I says, this is free ground. Then I looked on the heavens, and I says, them is free and beautiful heavens. Then I looked within my heart, and I says to myself, I wonder why I was never free before." It's a really powerful quote. The Exodusters were a group of Black Americans who leave the South and move west to Kansas following the lead of a man named Pap Singleton. He promises them freedom, that they can take advantage of the opportunities out west and be treated differently if they establish a community out there. And they do, and they're successful. So the Homestead Act is very important. And then consider this question: what characteristics of the West made it attractive to those seeking economic opportunity? So why go? Also, look at this chart or this timeline based on the dates of admission. Which decade did the most population growth in the West probably take place? Because remember that you have to have a certain amount of people living within a territory in order to vote to become a state. And so you see places reaching that population threshold requirement very quickly and all at once. So the West is going to be swept by enormous change after the Civil War. We've talked about transcontinental railroads and who is going out there: settlers, ranchers, miners, millions of acres of Western land. Mining is the first great boom in the West. Gold and silver attract a lot, right? What's that song? Oh, My Darling Clementine, right? And the team, the San Francisco 49ers, the discovery of gold in 1849 brings people out to California. And there are a lot more places like that out west who experience these massive population booms because of the mining industry. So here, where it is orange, those are gold mining towns, and then also the date in which sort of that mineral was found. And then in the purple, those are silver mining towns. But there are other places as well that are or other minerals that are being farmed as well. Leadville, we're going to talk about, is really important. Pikes Peak in just a moment. So it says the hope of wealth from gold and silver drew many Americans west. Where were the biggest gold mining regions, and how do you think gold discoveries affected migration? So, the migration of miners and ranchers to Western territories resulted in populations that were large enough to qualify for statehood. And they're shipping what they find back east. And mining is really going to be the first industry to attract settlers to the West after the Civil War. And it's going to be very, very, very popular. There's a huge demand for minerals back east. Remember in topic 2, talking about the growth of industry and how the raw materials being harvested out west are fueling the growth of industry back east. And the United States is participating in this slow transition from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. So these boom towns emerge, places who are towns that sort of pop up based solely on the presence of miners. That, okay, something is found here, and then this whole town springs up, and the economy of the town is based on people coming to work to find that material. And this is a pattern. They're called boom towns. So you find a strike, prospectors arrive, and then from there, families are established and towns grow. There's no real law out there because they're not states yet, and so you see the establishment of vigilance committees, or even you could call them vigilante groups, who take responsibility for law and order in those communities. Now, as the minerals in that area may begin to become less and less, or the demand for those minerals decreases, then you start to see some boom towns that go bust. And this is a lot of the reason why we have ghost towns, just one of the reasons why, out west, if you've ever heard that term before. There's Pikes Peak, Leadville. Mining leads to statehood. It leads to railroads being built through the mountains. Denver becomes the second largest city in the West behind San Francisco. This is also going to fuel the need to push Native Americans out of these areas because settlers want to live and mine. These are, again, just a map of dates of statehood so you can see everything's happening pretty close together. And then this is a picture of Leadville, Colorado, considered to be a boom town. Mining technology, don't get too caught up in the details here. These are just images of the different styles of mining. You've probably seen placer mining before. Sluice mining is when the water sort of being channeled down a piece of wood and sifted from there. And then hydraulic mining, which is really devastating to the environment, where just large blasts of water are used to clear away top layers of soil and hopefully reveal mineral deposits underneath. So there are lots of environmental consequences to the mining industry. There's another image of hydraulic mining. Farmers are also going to move to the Great Plains. And remember, we referenced that Homestead Act. Settlers have to work with a really difficult environment. And there's a picture, I think, here. Yeah, so these are sod houses because they're using what they have available to them to build their homes. And so here you have a home built out of sod. But it's a very difficult place to farm. They're going to farm on the area of the Great Plains. And remember, they're buying a lot of land from the land grants that the railroads were selling in addition to the Homestead Act. By 1890, the land in the plains has largely been settled and cultivated, and there's no longer like the great American frontier. It's been settled. You have colleges focusing on agriculture and mechanics that start to pop up. What are these innovations? Things like dry farming. If you plant a seed deep enough, it can access the moisture that's there existing for them underwater. There's also steel plows, threshing machines, seed drills, and reapers that are all designed to make it easier to farm, but it also makes more sense to have a larger tract of land, because all that equipment, in order to be a successful farmer out west, is expensive equipment. And you can really only afford it if you are making, or it really only is efficient. It only makes sense for you to invest that kind of money in expensive equipment if you are farming a large tract of land. So over time, these small farmers start to become a thing of the past. By the 1880s, the United States is the world's exporter of wheat, but there's a horrible drought also in the 1880s, and many people lose their homes or they have to mortgage. This is the beginning of the idea of a mortgage, where I'm going to have to take out a loan on a tract of land that I had previously gotten for free, maybe even under the Homestead Act. We talked about the closing of the frontier. There's no more safety valve. There's no more place to move out west. And what kinds of consequences will that have for the United States? We're going to even be talking about imperialism in a couple of topics down the road. And how is that related to the closing of the frontier? And I want you to think about how new technologies helped settlers, but also hurt small farmers. There's that sod house again. And again, some technology, the steel plow, the reaper, barbed wire, interestingly, is going to be important for some farmers, but also really devastating for ranchers, which are the next group we're getting ready to get to. And it's sort of considered the introduction of barbed wire is also sort of considered the end. Well, hang on. The end of the American West. The end of the American West with the introduction of barbed wire. So think about that. It says it keeps animals out of cropland, but it also really damages or hurts the ability for ranchers to move their cattle as they wanted. So ranching, which is what we were just talking about. Many moved west to herd cattle in the Great Plains. The Texas Longhorn is a really valuable type of cattle. They're able to survive in really tough circumstances, and Texas is certainly a tough environment to raise livestock in. Because of this idea of the open range, ranchers are able to take advantage of grazing on land for free, again, until the end of the open range with the introduction of barbed wire. So the long drive is this. This is what cowboys were used for, right? The first long drive is from 1866. Cowboys would take a rancher's cattle from their ranch to a railroad, right? And they would put the cows on the railroad car and take them back east for slaughter. Eventually, with the development of refrigerated railroad cars, they could take even more, right? Because they could slaughter the cattle first and then take the meat. But the slaughterhouses for now are back in places like Chicago. So they were being taken there. Abilene, Kansas is a big cattle town. These are just some routes of the long drive, the different trails. The Chisholm Trail is a very popular one. This is what you're watching when you're watching cowboy movies where they're moving the cattle and they have to make it to a certain place at a certain time. Cattle ranching fueled another boom in the West, sparked by the available grass. But once the railroad starts to move in, then again, the race is on for land and water. Let's see. Land is going to be broken up for farming. This is going to be the end of the open range. Prices drop, which we've mentioned. There's a harsh winter. Ranches are ultimately fenced in, and cowboys become ranch hands. Land use in the West. Ranching is an economic activity throughout much of the West. How might the physical geography of the West have affected where ranching flourished most? Grazing land is there in orange. The Hispanic Southwest. The United States is going to acquire the Mexican territory in 1848 with something called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The residents living in that territory get to keep both their property and they also become citizens. It's a way a lot of people who trace their heritage back to that region become citizens of the United States. Landowners and newcomers in California, landowning elite with haciendas, those are sort of like plantations, are going to be challenged by new white settlers, for example, these 49ers. And then you see conflict between the existing Hispanic inhabitants of this area, even before the treaty is signed, clashing with white settlers who want to live on that land. There's a group called the Whitecaps who sort of will go and cut holes in barbed wire fences, which obviously the white settlers take great offense to. But the cowboy, what we think of as the American cowboy, is actually a Spanish, or not a Spanish, excuse me, well, Spanish, but then Mexican construct. It's going to be those vaqueros, as they're called, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of, but they're going to be the model for the American cowboy. And then I can't resist, if I can bring in a Jimmy Fallon sketch into history class, then I'm going to do that.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Coming up this week, we have Russell Brand, Tracy Morgan, Michael Stipe, Emily Blunt. It's going to be a great week. So excited. It's week 2.
Hey, Jimmy. Hey, great show so far, but why haven't you done any jokes about the Gadsden Purchase?
I'm sorry, what?
The Gadsden Purchase, signed in 1854 by President Franklin Pierce, granted the U.S. sovereignty over the southern tips of Arizona and New Mexico. You see, the terrain in the southernmost portion of the Mexican Cession, 1848, was too rocky for the transcontinental railroad. So,
wait, you brought a visual aid. That's you carry that around everywhere you go, or?
I do love the Gadsden Purchase.
Well, if you love this thing so much, why would you want me to make a joke about it?
I mean, you got to be able to laugh at the Gadsden Purchase. I mean, it's what life's all about.
Life is all about laughing at the Gadsden. Maybe that's what your life's about, but I don't see what's so funny about a 150-year-old land treaty.
Well, I mean, just look at all the comedic possibilities. I mean, you got Franklin Pierce, hello, James Gadsden, not to mention topographical issues regarding the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, the jokes practically write themselves.
Yeah, I don't think that's true.
You know what? I just thought of a joke. Do you guys want to hear it? What's the only difference between the Gadsden Purchase and the Louisiana Purchase?
I give up. What?
The Louisiana Purchase was signed in 1803 and gave the U.S. 800,000 square miles of French territory, and the Gadsden Purchase didn't suck.
Oh, that's a pretty great joke. Except he forgot the part about how the Gadsden Purchase never would have happened if it weren't for the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Up top, baby.
I'm sorry. Who are you?
I'm that guy's worst nightmare. The guy who loves the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Signed 1848. Ended the Mexican-American War.
Wait, you have the actual treaty with you?
No, but it's a pretty decent replica.
Okay, that is just sad. That's really sad. What do you think about all this?
The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is nothing more than a poor man's Clayton Bulwer Treaty.
You got me there, buddy.
That's awful cute, beard boy. Now I got a joke for you. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Best treaty in the world.
All right, I think I see where this is going. The best treaty in the world, who?
What, are you stupid? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Who wants to party?
Hey, just curious, but what do you guys think of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty?
You mean the 1842 treaty that resolved minor boundary disputes between U.S. and Canada?
Yes, negotiated by U.S. Secretary of State Daniel Webster.
I love the Webster-Ashburton Treaty.
Me too. Dad?
Okay, that's enough. But I do think that's funny, and maybe it will help you remember the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Okay, this is another, it's a piece of artwork depicting the Mexican vaqueros who later become the American cowboys. The Great Plains are going to be the last part of the country to be heavily settled by white people. But the region is going to be originally set aside for Native Americans because it's viewed as too dry for agriculture. The Transcontinental Railroad, of course, is going to change the desirability for that land, and so we start to see huge migration of Europeans into that area as well in the late 1800s, but they're not the only immigrant group. We also need to talk about the Chinese and how they are treated. And so this is a fairly lengthy video. I am going to let it play for you, and you should watch it. You may want to pause and come back to it, however you want to do it. It's about 9 minutes long.
On June 30th, 1885, as the fundraising campaign for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty finally began to pick up speed, a letter appeared in the pages of the New York Sun. Written by a young Chinese immigrant and recent college graduate named Samsung Bo, who had come to America years earlier as a small boy and who dreamed of becoming a lawyer.
Sir, a paper was presented to me yesterday for subscription among my countrymen toward the pedestal fund of the Statue of Liberty. My countrymen and myself are honored in being thus appealed to as citizens in the cause of liberty. But the word liberty makes me think of the fact that this country is the land of liberty for all men of all nations, except the Chinese. That statue represents liberty holding a torch, which lights the passage of those of all nations who come into this country. But are the Chinese allowed to come? Are the Chinese here allowed to enjoy liberty as men of all other nationalities enjoy it? Free from the insults, abuse, assaults, wrongs, and injuries from which men of other nationalities are free. By the law of this nation, a Chinaman cannot become a citizen. Whether this statute against the Chinese or the Statue of Liberty will be the more lasting monument to tell future ages of the liberty and greatness of this country, will be known only to future generations. Samsung Bo.
The solitary arm of the unfinished Statue of Liberty had languished on Madison Square in New York for more than 5 years, when on May 6, 1882, on the eve of the greatest wave of immigration in American history, President Chester A. Arthur signed into law an extraordinary piece of federal legislation. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was unlike any law enacted since the founding of the Republic. Singling out as never before a specific race and nationality for exclusion, it made it illegal for Chinese workers to come to America, and for Chinese nationals already here ever to become citizens of the United States. Fueled by deep-seated tensions over race and class and national identity that had been festering since the founding of the Republic, it was the first in a long line of acts targeting the Chinese for exclusion, and it would remain in force for more than 60 years. It continues to shape the debate about what it means to be an American to this day.
Chinese Americans always have this identification with the founding principle of this country, so beautifully laid out by the founding fathers and so eloquently articulated in the Declaration of Independence and in American Constitution. The Chinese identify with this fundamental principle of liberty, equality, and justice for all. And all men are created equal. Now, how can you say that this is a group of people who are biologically and culturally unfit to live a civilized life, to appreciate and practice American culture, political, and religious ideals? That's why I think a lot of Americans had a hard time to learn that the Chinese Exclusion Act really exists for 60 years. They couldn't believe it. The government did that.
We have to remember that for most of the 19th century, immigration into the United States was basically open. You just showed up. So the Chinese exclusion law is one of the first really comprehensively restrictive laws. And it's also the first and only time in the entire history of the United States that a group is singled out by name, Chinese, by name, as being undesirable. So this is truly a remarkable moment.
Starting in California, the Chinese were marked as different. And I see the 1882 bill as a link in a chain of bills and a chain of legislation and race riots and purges that are trying to move the country toward ethnic cleansing. The 1882 bill was not about labor. I think it was about white purity. And how do we get rid of people who are different?
Many people think of this exclusion law as being very racist, very unfair. But if you look at the world at that time, every country was like that, and almost every ethnicity. Try to be a citizen of China or try to be a citizen of Japan is impossible unless you're ethnically Chinese or Japanese. But this is a group of people, Chinese American, the Chinese that were here, who actually fought back and made America better than what it was and helped make America what it is today, the values that we have, including equal protection under the law, rights to education, what it means to be American, what makes you American, to be born here. All these weren't defined.
The 1882 exclusion law has been forgotten, but once we remember it, it is outrageous. And it's probably why we've forgotten it, because it is so outrageous. Many Americans today cannot believe this happened. How could this country, in its culture, in its politics, in its economics, do what it did against a whole class of people? The exclusion law said that whole race of people are banned from this country. So it's a racial exclusion law. So that banning of a whole category of people directly challenges foundational questions of what American freedom means and what American history means, who we the people can constitute.
I think it's essential that Americans know about the exclusion of Chinese, not because it's the Chinese, but because it reflects how America has come to develop, how America saw itself at one time, and how it continues to see itself. It has much to do with the character of our national history, and that, to me, is the most important thing in understanding how we became who we are today. Some of it has to do with the fact that we excluded Chinese for 60 years.
Okay. I think that's pretty powerful, and also a part of our history that isn't heavily touched on. And so we can sometimes forget the contribution of Chinese Americans to the foundation of the western part of the United States. This is a pretty powerful image, I think, as well. Frequently faced with job discrimination, some Chinese immigrants managed to start their own businesses. These immigrants posed proudly in front of their own grocery store. So despite the discrimination, there are still examples of success for Chinese Americans. This is the immigrant population west of the Mississippi from 1880 through 1920, which shows you the growth. And we will come back with our next part soon.